Well, I think the European leaders are dreadful, and they're failing. And we can start from the point of view that the greatest warmongers of our day, Starmer of the UK, Merz of Germany, and Macron of France, uh, have the most tenuous hold on power and political authority within their own countries. They have approval ratings of about 20% and disapproval ratings of about 80%. And that's true of all three of these warmongers. So I think we can't quite make sense of it in the in a rational sense. These are failed politicians. They have a failed approach to this crisis, and so I don't want to rationalize their failure. Uh, it also makes it a little bit hard to understand this persistence in failure. What they have been recommending actually for 3 years, more than 3 years, since Russia and Ukraine nearly reached a negotiated agreement in April 2022, is continued war that brings no solutions for any of their own objectives. Uh, Europe is economically in a growing crisis. This war and the break of economic relations with Russia has led to a significant downturn and continuing decline of the European economy. The war is a huge distraction from what Europe should be doing to try to regain some focus on technological competition with the United States and China. Instead, Europe is completely obsessed with sanctions on Russia and with fighting this war. So the economics have not played to Europe's interest. But more than that, of course, the battlefield has been devastating. Since the break off of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in April 2022, Ukraine has lost territory, lost well over 1 million, and by some counts, roughly 2 million uh, people to death and serious injury from this war. The demographics of people fleeing Ukraine are obvious and also devastating. Ukraine can't keep the lights on anymore throughout the country. So, what is being accomplished by this continued insistence on a victory over Russia, that Ukraine will retake all ground, Russia will pay reparations, Russian assets will be seized, Russia will be brought to account, uh, NATO will expand to Ukraine. In other words, every delusional idea which is impossible to implement continues to this day to be the view of these European leaders. And the public is having none of it because none of it works, none of it makes sense. So you ask me why? I can't tell you why, except that these are failed politicians. Okay, I'll try to rationalize a bit why they think that, or they claim to think that it's better to fight Russia on the front line, so-called, and have the Ukrainians do it because otherwise Russia will show up in Berlin or Paris or London. Uh, the only way Russia's showing up in these places is as tourists or possibly investors, not as troops. So the rationalization that's given, we have to stop Russia here. Otherwise, Russian expansionism will overtake Europe. That's a common meme, and you find it in some of the comment pages of the British newspapers and so forth. It's a nonsense. It's false. It's never put to the test through negotiations, but that seems to be the claim. Is there some hidden force of war profiteering that's part of this? I actually don't think so, that's fundamental. One might have said 3 years ago that Europe was just responding to U.S. pressures, and that seemed to be a viable way to understand Europe's warmongering. But with Trump trying to end the war one way or another, the continued European extremism on the war cannot be explained by the U.S. pressure. So I think that it is delusional. And of course, one more factor to be mentioned. Russia's frontline neighbors, the Baltic states and Poland, are, for historical reasons that one can maybe understand, although I don't agree with, are rabidly Russophobic. And there is a view in Europe, we must hold together, and so we must let our frontline Eastern states dictate the European-wide policy. So there's a certain dimension of this, that this is just the way that Europe itself is holding together to let the most Russophobic voices speak. I mean, how else could one explain that Europe has turned its foreign policy machinery over to a vice president, high representative of Europe from Estonia, who is morning till night till morning vulgarly Russophobic, I would say, and completely antithetical to diplomacy. Of course, I'm speaking of Kaja Kallas. So uh, there's no true good justification for the European position. There are some explanations that may be behind what we're seeing, but these are failed policies. That's the bottom line. Again, one of the European officials involved in this said in the press, I think it was reported in the Financial Times, that this is a repackaging of what has been said without anything new. Europe is simply perseverating. It's simply repeating the same points. The same with Zelensky, who rules by martial law against the overwhelming desire of his own country to stop this war at the negotiating table. So we're not seeing anything new. Maybe in terms of trying to rationalize this one more time, there was a view going into this provocation. It dates back to the 1990s, actually, when the United States laid out the plan to expand NATO to Ukraine and to Georgia, and for the European Union to expand to include these countries. Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1997 analyzed what Russia's response would be. And he wrote a book about this, The Grand Chessboard. And in his analysis, he said Russia would be extremely unhappy about all of this, but it could not resist this. The view was, in the end, if the West is strong and clear and perseveres, Russia will be defeated. And this may be also one of the implicit or explicit beliefs of these European leaders, that they somehow have Russia on the run, that it's about to collapse, it's about to crumble, the economy is about to fail, the battlefield situation is about to turn. All of this is delusional. And one of the delusions back in 1997 of Brzezinski, quite interesting because it's very explicit, and he was an analyst, and so he wrote down his assumptions and his predictions. He said that Russia would have no alternative because it would never turn to China, for example. A Russia-China alliance, he said, was out of the question. And he also said no one in the West would be so stupid as to make that happen. But here is Russia basically uh, taking the viewpoint we don't depend on following European diktats. We don't depend on Europe's goodwill. We don't even depend on the United States' goodwill, which is uh, perhaps even more consequential. If Europe uh, persists in this way, we will deal with the BRICS countries. We will deal with the Eurasian countries towards the east. China is our main economic partner. We trade with India. Between the two of them, that's 37% of the world population. We are a good standing leading member of the BRICS, which is nearly 50% of the world population and more than 40% of world GDP. We don't need the European Union to agree with us. And if the European Union persists in this one-sided, arrogant, and deaf approach, deaf in the sense that it has not listened to anything Russia has said since 1990, well, okay, we have alternatives. And I think that also was, and perhaps until very, very recently. One should also add Trump is a bumbling, uh, not well informed, not very bright person. And so there is no clear U.S. position or U.S. strategy. I think there is a desire by Trump to end this war. He's ready to listen more. But the U.S. is also very inconsistent, and the Europeans have found that by continuing their hard line, they bring Trump back into line. In other words, they've gotten this meeting in Budapest canceled just now. I think it is a European effect, which affected the White House. Trump is not strong enough, clear thinking enough, strategic enough to lead. So he's very responsive to the European pressures, and maybe the Europeans feel we'll just keep after this. After all, it's the Ukrainians dying. Eventually, Russia will collapse under the weight of all of this. This is wrong. It's profoundly cynical. It is against what their own publics want. It's against what the Ukrainian people want. But after all, how much confidence do you have in Starmer, Merz, and Macron? Their own countrymen despise them. This is the point. I think that there's another point that one can add exactly in this regard, which is that perhaps another part of, maybe it's obvious, but then should be mentioned, therefore, that another part of the Macron, Merz, Starmer idea is not just that Russia will finally crumble if we persevere, but the idea that the Russophobia is our main political instrument for mobilizing public opinion in Europe to enable us to build a military that we don't have. In other words, we should use this as the opportunity. Maybe it is the opportunity to create the military and strategic autonomy of Europe. And so we have to exaggerate the Russia fear to bring our publics along. This may be a crude political tactic. We know Macron, he wants an autonomous Europe. By the way, so do I. I think it's the right approach. But maybe he thinks that to lie about it, to grossly exaggerate the threat from Russia is the way to bring it about rather than telling the truth. Well, Macron lies relentlessly. He's lied to me because he said privately to me, yes, NATO was the reason for this war, and then publicly exactly the opposite. And that kind of politics, well, it can work for a while, but his approval rating is the lowest of all of them, by some measures around 13% approval. And so, in other words, 87% disapproval. Um, and I think the public senses that these politicians are not leveling with their citizens. They're telling fables for whatever reason, and it doesn't resonate. Well, there's no mediation. And it's not even a proxy war, it's a war. NATO is at war with Russia. And it's not just NATO equipment and NATO financing and NATO intelligence and NATO targeting, it's NATO personnel. Because very frequently you have American and European dead being sent back. We know that there are NATO personnel in Ukraine. There need to be with these weapon systems. This is not something that these are managed by the Ukrainians. This is perfectly known. So this isn't even a proxy war. It's true that most of the deaths are Ukrainian deaths, and that's what makes it so convenient from the point of view of the warmongers in the United States and Europe. But this is a direct war, and a very dangerous one, because it's a war between two nuclear superpowers, the United States and Russia. And when Trump talks this way, that yes, maybe we'll have the Tomahawks, or maybe we'll entertain a new offensive, that's a war between the U.S. and Russia. If Russia were having some Caribbean nation lob missiles into the United States, things would not be so calm in the U.S. But what the U.S. does vis-a-vis Russia is absolutely extraordinary and profoundly dangerous. So how long can this go on? It can continue to kill Ukrainians in very large numbers. It could escalate into something absolutely horrifying, or it could actually end sensibly the way that it should. But for that, we have to understand one last point, which is that Trump is a very weak leader, even not really a leader. He falls prey to flattery, which is part of the idea of the European plan, so-called, is to put Trump on as chair of some peace board, like Trump put himself in Gaza. This is almost like a comic book, but this is also the European flattery. It's the Secretary General of NATO calling Trump daddy. Is this the real world of adults that actually have nuclear weapons, or is this some horrifying comic strip? This is the situation. We have a very inconsequent, uh, uh, unknowledgeable, and mercurial and temperamental president of the United States who demands flattery and adulation. We have European leaders profoundly unpopular. We have a pretty clear way that peace could actually be achieved, which is that Ukraine would be neutral. There would be a territorial agreement reached. There would be, on the basis of neutrality, a demilitarized region, so that Ukraine, Europe, and Russia would all be safe from each other. And this would be the basis for peace from on the foundations of indivisible security. It's not hard to map this out, but it would take a bit of insight, knowledge, historical responsibility. And unfortunately, we don't have that in the Western countries right now anywhere. And so this is why we continue to not only endlessly circle around this and endlessly come up with absurd proposals, but why Ukraine continues to be such a devastating graveyard for Ukrainians day after day, week after week. And no Western leader other than Viktor Orban and Roberto Fico and probably a growing number of Europeans in the coming months, Mr. Babic as new prime minister of the Czech Republic. Maybe they'll finally be able to have their voice heard within Europe to say enough is enough. This has gone on far too long for our good and for our safety. There's delusions in all of the main capitals, in Washington, in London, in Paris, in Berlin. But the most delusional of all actually is in London because the British Empire still exists in the minds of these people. And when you mentioned these British inspired attacks on Russian nuclear facilities, this is the insanity that continues to grip the long gone British Empire.